All right, good evening. Thank you so much for coming. This is the event for the City of Science at the CUNY Graduate Center, where knowledge is a public good. Thanks to the many people who made tonight's possible, including the AV staff and the events teams here at the GC. And we're here to consider Dr. Jane Goodall's scientific legacy and what it means to study great apes and other primates today, scientifically, ethically, and conservation advocacy-wise. But before we get to discussing Dr. Jane Goodall's scientific advances, we have to mention that Professor Birute Galdikas, who was a professor at Simon Fraser University and studied orangutans along the prominent primatologists and great ape researchers like Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall. She passed away yesterday at the age of 79. So we had this kindly called primates of folks studying gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans, and unfortunately none of them are with us today. I'm your panel moderator, Dr. Mark Hauber. I'm a professor of comparative psychology, and if you wonder what that is, it's another fancy word for animal behavior, in case you're tenured in psychology. Here at the Graduate Center, and I'm also the executive director of the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center. Tonight we gather to celebrate and reflect on the remarkable life and scientific legacy of Dr. Jane Goodall. And before I say any more, can I see a show of hands of who actually met in the same physical space, Dr. Goodall? Anybody from the audience? Have you met her? Have you seen her give a talk? Very good. There's a couple people. Anybody in the panel? Very good. So she was a remarkable person who radiated that kind of milieu that you only see every now and then. The other person who I saw this radiation was Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard, of course. Tonight we gather because she was a researcher whose research activity for 6 decades among the chimpanzees of Gombe, Tanzania, transformed not only primatology, but our understanding of what it means to be human and part of the larger living ecological world. Dr. Goodall, who passed away late in 2025 at the age of 91, left us with groundbreaking discoveries about chimpanzee societies, about tool use, but also a passionate global call for conservation and youth empowerment. Our panel this evening brings together 3 accomplished CUNY professors whose own works intersect with Dr. Late Goodall's studies in several and productive ways. The first of our panelists is Dr. Kristin Andrews of philosophy here at the CUNY Graduate Center, whose research on animal minds and morality challenges us to rethink objectivity and the boundaries between species. Dr. David Lahti of Queen's College and the Graduate Center of CUNY works on the evolution of animal behavior, his studies offer insights into Jane Goodall's scientific innovations, her critics' point of views, and what it means to have both evolved and developed non-human culture. And Dr. Jessica Rothman of Anthropology at Hunter College and here at the Graduate Center, she conducts field research that helps us understand what it means to study primates today, from their food choices to their current and future conservation. Together we will explore how Dr. Jane Goodall's methods broke educational and scientific molds. She had a PhD but not a bachelor's degree. How her data reshaped debates about evolution, culture, emotion, and morality amongst animals and amongst humans, and how her advocacy laid foundations for protecting great apes in a rapidly and anthropogenically changing world. Just for practicality, we will try to talk into the microphones, both the panel and the Q&A session at the end, because that's how our Zoom participants will hear us. We will talk until about 7:30, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A by members of the audience. Thank you, and let us begin. So my first question will go to David. If you had to explain to a newcomer which one of Jane Goodall's early results most changed primatology and evolutionary biology, what would it be?
That's a difficult question because even in her very first paper on feeding behavior in chimps, which represented the very first time anyone, not only a female, not only on chimps, had sat and had she had 800 field hours at that point studying an animal in its, a great ape in its natural habitat. And she has, almost every line has something in there that had never been observed before. But I would say in terms of changing the field or changing how we view animals, I would have to have a top three. Number three would be the tool use thing. I mean, she had to read this book called Man the Toolmaker at Cambridge during her PhD. And literally, she found evidence against that being a hallmark feature of humans. Not only tool use, because some people came back and said, okay, but only humans manufacture tools. Well, that wasn't true either. She came up with a follow-up paper that showed that they manufacture them on the spot, especially if they're not working quite right. In the first tool that she mentioned finding was these sticks that termites peel until they're sticky, or even other materials that are more bendy, like grass, and the chimp puts them into termite mounds and pulls it out, and the termites are stuck to them, and then they have a specialized way of eating them. So this idea that that other animals share this feature that was thought to be by the scientific consensus unique to humans was, I would say, a huge change. Number two, and this doesn't get mentioned very much, but it's sort of like a gestalt from her whole life of research, is individual differences. So from her favorite mother, Flo, who was just a wonderful mother and grandmother and formed strong coalitions, to this disturbed, distracted, volatile Passion, another mother, and from the sort of reclusive David Greybeard that she befriended, all the way to Fegan, Flo's son, who was so friendly that even mothers would allow an adult male to play with her toddlers. That is extremely rare in chimps. She documented how different chimps can be. And this rattled the establishment too, because we were, I'm speaking, as in this lineage of ethology, we tended to think of organisms as being representative of their species. So if, this is the way a tiger is, this is the way a squirrel is, et cetera. So to have this variety of personality within a species was something that I think changed the way we think. And this segues into number one, which has to be animal minds, right? I mean, it has to be this idea that chimps have a mental life. And for her, this meant intentionality, consciousness, emotion. I would challenge anybody to read the accounts, whether professional, semi-professional, or even her personal accounts of these animals. And then of several people after that, including Jessica's work, and not think that these animals have some sort of mind that demands our attention.
Thank you, David. That was great. And of course, we can view Dr. Jane Goodall in action, on the slide behind us. But Kristin, I have a question to you, which is, how did Dr. Goodall's presence next or within social units of the chimpanzees and the practice of individually naming the subjects of this investigation challenge our views of observer neutrality and the conclusion that she actually could draw from her data?
Yeah, Jane Goodall had a real challenge. She had many challenges going into Gombe as an untrained person, starting a new science without having people to follow. But she was doing this at a time when behaviorism was the mainstream scientific paradigm that people were working in when they were thinking about animal behavior. And in the behaviorist tradition, you didn't think about the animal mind. You didn't think that animals had individual personalities. You certainly didn't think that they made tools or anything like that. But you thought you could understand them by looking at inputs and outputs, and that would be enough. What you shouldn't do is start to form relationships with the animals that you're studying. You shouldn't name them. You shouldn't name David Graybeard, the float, like would be ridiculous. And you certainly shouldn't use gender pronouns with them. All of the animals are its. Jane Goodall broke all those rules. She named the animals she interacted with. She discussed them using gender pronouns. The scientific establishment then was very critical of her. Who is this untrained person writing these, anthropocentric or romantic stories of the chimpanzees? But she persevered. She didn't let them shut her down. She kept doing it. She kept using names. She kept using gender pronouns. And she kept doing what she thought she needed to do, and that was describe from the perspective of an anthropologist going into a new culture what these individuals were doing as individuals and how they were creating community together. And I think that this was really a revolutionary change. It really was the foundation of modern primatology, to think about the animals as an anthropologist would think about a new society that they entered, and not be so afraid to just treat the chimpanzees as if they were minded individuals and so on. And I think that Louis Leakey really wanted somebody who wasn't afraid to use names and gender pronouns, and that's why he thought Jane Goodall would be such a good person to initiate the study of chimpanzees, because she wasn't burdened with these rules of what you weren't supposed to do. And in fact, that's what Jane Goodall said when we offered her an honorary doctorate at York University in her speech. When she accepted that, she said, "Yeah, Louis picked me because I didn't know what I wasn't allowed to do." And I thought that was something we should all remember.
That's a great line. Thank you. Jessica, my question to you is, as a researcher, as a 21st century primatologist who is at the prime of her research, what are some of the methods that were inspired or perhaps that parallel or differ from those of Dr. Goodall that you use?
Sure. Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. And I think I want to echo my colleagues and say that we learned so much from Jane Goodall and her original methods. And the first thing I want to point out is she was the first one to really get close and explore the inner life of chimpanzees and really any primate. Just, she habituated the chimpanzees, meaning that they allowed her to get into their lives, and she was able to watch them from close range, record their behaviors, and spend hours, just years with them. So that's the first thing, and we continue to do that as primate researchers. The second is that, as both David and Kristin said, she really humanized the chimpanzees, and instead of giving them numbers and saying it, she gave them names. And we still do this today. So all of the primates that I study are individually recognizable, the same way that the chimps that Jane Goodall, and she recorded different kinds of facial characteristics, and she really knew each and every individual chimpanzee. Same thing in the primates that I study. So I've been working on monkeys, and also I studied gorillas for my PhD. So for the past 30 years, I do this work in Uganda. And, we habituate the animals, but we do things a little bit differently. So you could see in this picture, Jane Goodall is touching chimpanzees. She's getting very close to the chimpanzees, and we don't do this anymore. So we've learned over the years that we can give the chimpanzees diseases, we can get diseases from the chimpanzees, and so we stay 8 meters away from any primate while we're studying them. And I could say that in 30 years, I've actually been to the field probably 6 months a year, every year, for the past 30 years, and I've never touched a primate. So we stay far away, we observe primates with binoculars, we are very cognizant of the fact that we can affect their environments. So even a step in the forest, a path, can change the way that water flows. It can change the way that vegetation grows in the forest. And so we're very mindful about the practices that we use in the forest. So that's a bit different. And we learned a lot from these experiences. Jane Goodall also had this amazing way of describing all of the behaviors that she saw, and she recorded everything and anything. And that's just so wonderful and so exciting. In my research, I'm actually very focused on feeding, diet, and nutrition. And so we basically go out with a lot more systematic observations. So we're looking for one thing, and we record it over and over and over again. And then we now have tools. Like it's been a while since Jane did her original research. We now have tools to actually help us understand what's happening inside the animals as well as outside. So we can record their behavior, but we can also collect urine. We collect the plants they eat. We collect poo-poo samples, and we can learn so much from this. So we can learn about genetics. We can learn about physiology. We can learn about things that tell us a lot about the animal without actually, necessarily having to do anything invasive. So I think that Jane Goodall really inspired generations of primatologists, and we have just built on what we've learned from her, and we've refined methods and explored new things, and she remains, such a big hero to all of us. There are improvements that we've made, and also lots and lots of discoveries that we've made as a result of it.
Thank you, Jessica. One thing I wanted to mention is that experimentation is, of course, difficult with some primates, great apes, but the power of long-term studies is something that all of us have taken. So, I have a colleague who studies birds like I do, and his major discoveries don't come from experiments. They come from long-term 20, 30-year-long observations. And so having studied the same animals again and again over time, no matter how big the troop is or how big the group is, has tremendous value. And we've learned that from long-term studies like the ones conducted by Dr. Goodall. David, I have the sort of maybe the heaviest question of the day, which is, what is non-human culture, and do chimpanzees have it?
Right. Well, in addressing this question of culture, it might be helpful to realize, of course, that the term culture we first developed to study humans. And in humans, culture means roughly shared ideas, which then generate shared traditions among a people. And so, and the way they get to be shared is through learning from each other. We don't genetically inherit the features that we call culture. That would actually disqualify it from being culture. So for instance, even if it's directly influenced by the environment without any learning, we don't call that culture either. So the fact that a bunch of people happen to live in a sunny place and they all get tans, unless that is influenced by of course it's influenced by their behavior, but the fact that they tan, just because it's shared, doesn't mean that it's culture. So once we realize that other animals socially learn their behavior too, and it can translate into traditions, like bird song, for instance, and then also food gathering and tool-making abilities in other animals, such as in some birds, but then also in chimps. Then we started thinking, well, why don't we use this word culture to apply to animals? But we can't get into the head of other animals. It's hard enough in anthropology, sociology, social psychology to figure out what people are thinking. So to find out what ideas are going around. We can't do that with animals, so we had to be at least methodologically behaviorist about it in terms of redefining culture in terms of what the animals are doing. So culture for non-human animals means behaviors that are socially learned, shared within a community, and can develop into traditions that are different in different communities. And it has to be shared again, and because one individual doesn't make a culture, and it has to be socially learned as well, because these other environmental induction and genetic inheritance don't fit the bill. So given that revised definition for non-human animals, we do see that chimps have culture. They don't learn their language the way that humans do, so they don't have linguistic culture to that extent, except for the milieu, the environments in which they give, the context in which they give certain calls can be learned and passed on, shared in a group. But there is very good evidence that they do have culture. For instance, there are traditions that vary from group to group that cannot possibly be genetically hardwired in, so to speak, or instinctual. They have been shown both in the wild and in captivity to learn techniques from each other. So that's another piece of evidence, a second piece of evidence. A third piece of evidence is that they have this social contagion, such that when one individual has a particular novel behavior, it'll spread through the community. This was shown very clearly by Kat Holbader, for instance, in Uganda with soaking up water with sponges. Once one individual did it, it just caught on like wildfire. And then fourth, and my favorite, is when you have useless behaviors that, like fashions, that just catch on because the other individuals think that they're really cool and start doing them. So sticking a long piece of grass, this is in Chimfunchi in Zambia, they documented the spread of just this goofy behavior of sticking a piece of grass in the ear and walking around, and everybody's like, oh, that's great, I want to do that. And then somebody started sticking it in their butt and having it stick out like a tail. And then other, apes do have tails, yeah. So then they started, that started catching on too. So all these four different kinds of evidence demonstrate, I believe, without a doubt, that chimps have culture from this revised animal-centric, non-idea, non-mentalistic, but behavioristic definition.
Thank you, David, for those examples too. Kristin, I have a question to you about the way other groups studied chimpanzees. And so near Gombe, there was another group from Japan that was contemporary of Dr. Jane Goodall's. And how did they study great apes? What was the difference, and what were some similarities?
Yeah, it's, I think, not as well known that the Japanese primatologists moved into Tanzania to study chimpanzees around the same time, just slightly after Goodall started her field site. And this field site of Mahale, which was started by a primatologist named Nishida, came from this lineage of Japanese primatologists traced back to a primatologist, a biologist named Imanishi, who was very important in Japanese biology. He was also an anthropologist, and he was studying culture in animals. The first animal he studied culture in was an insect, mayfly nymphs. And he was looking at society in these petri dishes. And then he got sent to Mongolia during the war, and he noticed that the horses also seemed to have societies, and he thought horses were more interesting than the mayfly nymphs. And so when he went back to Japan, he sent his students to go look for some wild horses to study. And they came back after a while and said, we didn't really find any horses, but we found these monkeys on Koshima Island. And you probably heard the story about the monkeys on Koshima Island because they engaged in this cultural behavior of washing sweet potatoes. Now, you might not know that that this behavior of washing sweet potatoes only emerged in this community because the scientists started watching them and feeding them sweet potatoes. So they were also, these primatologists were bird watchers originally, and in order to draw out the monkeys, they put sweet potatoes out the way you might put seed out to attract birds. But it took a really long time before the monkeys were willing to come out onto the beach, and because most of the time they were hiding in the forest. And once they started coming out, one of the monkeys started taking a sweet potato into the salty water and washing it before eating it. Now, we don't know why. Maybe it tasted good. Maybe there was dirt on it. But the behavior spread to others in the community. So this is, as David said, an example of social learning. They weren't born knowing how to do this. It was a behavior that was innovated by one individual, and then others picked it up as well. And the monkeys in this area continue this behavior today. How many years later is it? A long time. But so when they started doing this research in Mahale, they took these same sorts of methods. They were really coming at it from an anthropological perspective. And I think that their methods were really similar to Jane's, even though Jane didn't have the same kind of training and background. So both Jane and the researchers at this other site started provisioning the animals in order to get the chimpanzees to come and hang out with them. This is also something we don't do anymore with wild primates. We don't provision them because it causes problems, social problems, conflicts. It can also lead to disease. But they both did that at both sites. And they both looked at the animals as if they were living in a society, as if they were a community with individuals and individual differences and forming these groups. But one thing that I thought was really interesting about, again, culture and these two research studies that were very close to each other, hard to get to because of the mountains, but very close to each other, was that in Gombe, chimpanzees would groom. And in Mahale, chimpanzees would groom. But in Mahale, chimpanzees would groom while holding hands. They did some specific behavior called a hand clasp groom. And you can see these very distinctive photographs of this behavior. And when the first visit happened from Gombe to Mahale, the researcher, Bill McGrew, saw this hand-clasp groom, and he said, "What is this? This isn't what chimpanzees do." And Nishida said, "What, don't all chimpanzees do this?" And that was the moment that they together discovered cultural differences and these different research sites with these two different communities of chimpanzees who biologically were the same, but culturally were really different.
Thank you. Thank you for that image too. Jessica, you're an honorary officer of the Uganda Wildlife Authority. Regarding chimpanzees, what are the threats to their conservation and how are their numbers faring these days?
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so it's very hard to tell how many chimpanzees there are because it's very difficult to do a census of the chimpanzees. Basically, chimpanzees make nests. The great apes make nests every night, and they don't usually reuse a nest. So nests are a way of counting chimpanzees that are not habituated to humans. And then we also have researchers in the field that know how many chimpanzees are in their communities, but chimpanzees travel very far. And it's important not to, count the same chimpanzees over and over. So the estimation is about 160,000 to 300,000 of the 4 subspecies of chimpanzees. There are 4 subspecies of chimpanzees. Now, some populations are doing better than others. In West Africa, the Western chimpanzees are actually declining at a very rapid rate. 80% since 1990, 80% decline. So that's actually a very depressing number, and those are critically endangered. So that's one subspecies. Where I work in Uganda, the forests are getting very fragmented. We have national parks. The chimpanzees inside the national parks are very well protected. They're protected by research efforts, but they're mainly protected by the government that has rangers and law enforcement, and they're also seen as valued to the communities because of ecotourism. So going to view chimpanzees brings in revenue, and they see it as an asset in their communities. So in some places, chimpanzee, there's hope. And I do want to say that the Jane Goodall Institute Jane was actually she was really, really excited about conservation. And this was her passion, especially towards the later part of her life. And Jane Goodall Institute is funding all of the different censuses that goes on. They partner with government organizations and with communities, and they fund the censuses, and they also provide community. They also do a lot of conservation education, and they try to improve and work with especially with chimpanzees that are outside of national parks to ensure their protection. So in Uganda, there's actually a movement where the local communities are trying to protect the forests where the chimpanzees are, because they see so much value. So I would say in some places there is hope, and it's actually the governments in the countries where chimpanzees live and also the communities that are actually conserving the chimps. Now, in terms of threats, you can imagine that habitat destruction is really a main threat. So the forests and savannas, chimpanzees also live in really hot savannas, like in Senegal and in Tanzania. They live in 90-degree savannas. They're running, they are going into baobab trees and eating the baobab fruits. So chimpanzees can live in a real diversity of habitats. And basically, habitats are being destroyed. When habitats are destroyed, chimpanzees get stressed. You can imagine, when all of us get stressed, we start, when I travel a lot, I start getting sick, I start getting respiratory infections. They come into contact more with humans. So disease is a big threat. And also, just food availability. They can sometimes go into people's crops. They see this as a way of getting high quality food. So going in, crop raiding, and then basically people get angry and, are fearful of the chimps, and the chimps are fearful of them, and there are retaliatory killings there too. So there are, there's a lot of problems, but there is also hope. And especially I want to say that it's really different from when I started in 1997. At least in Uganda, where there wasn't a lot of ecotourism. The government organizations were just starting up. The government of Uganda there was a new Uganda Wildlife Authority that was coming up that started in 1998. And now, there's just an explosion of support for great apes in the country, and that's really promising.
Thank you, Jessica. So we heard the external dangers and negative impacts on chimpanzees, but David, I was going to ask you about the war at Gombe and how that discovery changed, our understanding of chimpanzee dynamics, societal growth, and behavior in general.
Yeah, this, what the media dubbed the Gombe War of the mid-1970s, changed Jane Goodall's view of chimps forever, caused her great distress, and she would later call it, so she wrote two main reflective books about her time with the chimps, one In the Shadow of Man, before this happened, and then the second one much later on, I think 1986. No, that was the review. It was 1990, was Through a Window. And in Through a Window, or if you just compare these two books, you can see the change that came over her. And she said that was a defining moment. And basically what had happened is that she had thought that, in a very famous quote that was in National Geographic, that chimps were, quote, rather nicer than humans. And from her experience, that was exactly true. Her early experience, her experience during the 60s, because the kinds of things that she viewed in the 70s were relatively rare. But they do exist. And so she documented first, before even the Gombe War happened, she documented a lot of killing, even killing by a mother-daughter pair who would go and rip infants out of other mothers' arms and then just kill them right in front of the mother, and even partially cannibalize them. And she also cited literature from other people, the Japanese group, that had shown death by cannibalism. And in one case, the chimp took an hour to die as it was being slowly dissected by its enemies. But this particular situation that happened was there was an unusual dearth of females. So there was a shortage of females, and these two groups of males that had coalitions separate from each other got into basically a fight that caused, so a fight that normally, if the groups stayed together, would have been resolved. But the fight caused a rift in the community, such that the two communities, and they're accustomed to this fission, but usually on the basis of food, and there's not a lot of bad blood. They just, one group goes one place, one group goes another. But in this case, there was already an animosity that had built up. And the way that Jane describes it is that in the absence of each other, the animosity just seethed. They were not able to resolve the situation. And so when they encountered each other, starting in 1974 to 75, they just started killing each other. And they fought until basically the Kasakela community had killed all of the adult males in the Kahama community, the splinter community, and even abducted some of the females and forced them to join the Kasakela community and mate with the Kasakela males. So that was the so-called war, and it impressed upon Jane Goodall and the community as a whole, and it was very well documented in her population dynamics paper. It impressed upon her a few things. One is that there is a dark side, as she called it, or an agonistic and a more negative side from an evaluative standpoint to chimpanzee behavior. So if the 60s was an era of her learning about their affiliation, their cooperation, these lovely mothers, et cetera, then the 70s was the story of, this killing, infanticide, this rarer but still very much a part of chimpanzee culture. And this leads me to a second thing that impressed upon her, which is that it could not be seen as purely anomalous, or as some people had said, a projection, anthropomorphic projection from the researchers. It was not that at all. She had studied it very closely, and to the point where she even knew what caused it. And she also realized, thirdly, that what she thought was a relatively loose community was not that at all. And so in all her later publications, she would make very clear that the chimpanzee community of 45 to 50 individuals is tightly bounded, and the boundaries are defended with lethal force. And so that's the way that chimps live. It's just a natural part of their lifestyle. And so it is something that can lead to lethal violence, but only on rare occasions. So it seems that on average, only between, depending on how you add things up, about 2 to 4% of chimps die from intergroup conflict over the course of their life. So a tiny minority of the deaths are attributed to that. Interestingly, it's about the same for humans. So roughly 200 million people died from war in the 20th century, depending on how you add it up, of 5.5 billion total deaths during the 20th century, and that gives you about the same percentage.
Let's talk about something a little more uplifting, and that will be philosophy. Kristin, this question is to you. Tell us about how a philosopher studies great apes, animal behavior, about what are the tools and the methods that you use to understand animal culture, animal minds, and morality.
Yeah, thanks for that. Philosophy as uplifting is a really nice image. Thank you so much for that. So in the last maybe 25 years, the philosophy of animal minds has really kind of started to mature as a subfield of philosophy. And the sorts of methods that we use in the philosophy of animal minds is, first of all, to ask questions about the kinds of questions that scientists are asking, and to investigate the methods that scientists are using when they're doing their scientific research. But then also to take the sorts of concepts that we are using when we're talking about behavior or morality or language, and trying to analyze what those concepts actually mean and what sort of work we want those concepts to do. So if we ask a question like, do chimpanzees have language? You may have heard of the ape language studies with attempts to teach chimpanzees and other great apes ways to communicate with humans using lexicograms, using some elements of sign language. And many of these projects have been really successful. We also just recently lost Kanzi, a bonobo, who was quite skilled at using lexicons to communicate with humans. A study just came out, one of the last studies with Kanzi just came out, where he had a pretend tea party with researchers where they poured invisible juice and then poured some invisible juice away and then offered Kanzi the full glass of invisible juice versus the empty glass of invisible juice, and Kanzi preferred the full glass of invisible juice. And so we ask questions about, well, what does it mean to be able to engage in this kind of pretend play? Is this a cognitive prerequisite for being able to represent things that aren't there? Is it the ability to consider alternative possibilities? And when you have the ability to consider alternative possibilities, can this let you do things like make plans or imagine living in a different sort of way? And this was like a question I had for David as you were describing the Gombe Wars, was to what extent that these kind of behaviors are universal in chimpanzees or cultural and present in some communities more so than in other communities. Because we also know this with other primates. Robert Sapolsky famously studied a troop of baboons where that was quite despotic and violent. But then the males who were despotic and violent all raided a camp garbage dump, and they ate poisoned meat or meat that was off, and they all died. And this allowed the community to transform. And so the females and the males that were left didn't let anyone immigrate into the group unless they participated in this more peaceful way of living together. And so this is a really, I think, a nice example of how we might think from a philosophical perspective that there was a norm change process going on in this community of baboons. And I'm curious about these possibilities in great apes and in chimpanzees and in other species as well. So we ask questions about the concepts, and we also ask questions about the methods that the scientists use. And we really, one of the things that I think is really important when we're asking questions about non-human animal minds is to recognize the limitations we have when we have access to other human minds, right? There is a very old philosophical problem called the problem of other minds. And this is the problem that I don't directly see anybody's mind. I see your behavior, I listen to what you say, your verbal behavior, but I have to interpret that as well. And we're interpreting other animals the same way we interpret humans, and recognizing those similarities, I think, is also really important.
Thank you so much for that. We talked about, methods of science, and also how Dr. Goodall got, sort of her start in Gombe with the chimpanzees. But Jessica, as a practitioner of modern primatology and bioanthropology, how do you identify a person? What is your method of recruitment for the next generation of scientists who are going to follow this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And, Louis Leakey took a big chance on people that he knew and the people that just had that passion and that desire to go out there and investigate these questions and go out and, just live in a place that was different to them. And I think to some extent, we use similar practices today. We look for creativity and passion and interest in questions rather than species, and the ability to withstand. I have to be a little careful because my grad students in the audience, but also the ability to withstand being in the field and being able to, to work in a rainforest for a very long period of time. And I think that the other part that's really important is cultural sensitivity. So we are very, very, very privileged to be able to work in the countries that we do, coming from the United States. And we go through a very extensive permit process in order to study the primates that we have, and we have to keep renewing that. We have to show progress. And so we want to recruit graduate students that are interested in the ideas that we have, but also are able to work in collaboration with scientists in the countries where we're working. So for me, it's in Uganda. We have lots of Ugandan collaborators, and we want to make sure that we're not repeating anything that they do, and complementing things that they're doing. And I think that this is really important in selecting graduate students. So we're not as much interested in courses or GPAs, but mainly in curiosity and creativity and and field experience. And I just want to say that sometimes in New York City, it's very hard for students. So I grew up in New York City. I went to the Bronx Zoo all the time, and then somebody took a chance on me when I was an undergraduate and brought me to the field. A graduate student brought me to the field, and that launched my career. So I had a graduate student and a faculty member. They paid for my trip out. I was young. I was just finishing my undergraduate, and I went out to the Bwindi Forest in Uganda and got a chance to study mountain gorillas. And that changed the course of my life. I mean, I'm sitting up here now. I have a program for the past 30 years. I went back to Uganda. And so, through my work, and I think through other primatology work, we've really tried to give opportunities to undergraduate students at early stages. And the National Science Foundation, NSF, has actually been really critical in providing those opportunities. So over 100 CUNY students have actually got to come to the forest, and that's fun. And most of those are funded positions, and they come out for a month and they kind of try it out. Try it out, see if it's something they like to do a research project, come back, analyze the data, present their research. And so it's a really nice way for students to actually have the experience before they apply and know whether they want to apply to graduate school. So I think, we've come a long way, and we've gotten, we've had a lot more opportunities than have been in the past. So, which is really nice, nice to have at this stage.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm glad you considered the process and the selection criteria, because some of us, like myself, are terrible role models for scientists. I never wanted to study anything but birds in my life. There was no scientific interest. I just wanted to fly, obviously, and I spent every one of my graduate interviews convincing people that I cared about the science, when all I wanted to do is study birds. So, if you're an undergraduate in the audience, try to come up with scientific questions for those interviews. Unfortunately, Jane Goodall is gone. And so my question to you, David, is how does the next generation find out about Jane Goodall's research? I know you have an incredible library, an incredible knowledge of the literature. You remember the years of the review versus the book and all of that. But how does the next generation come to find out about Jane Goodall's research?
Well, I would suggest that students, number one, hold out to find what people in the humanities call the locus classicus of an idea, meaning the person who first had it. And of course, this can be a wild goose chase. Sometimes you'll just go down a rabbit hole and be looking at citation after citation and going back and back. But when we talk about tool use, it's remarkable how little Jane gets cited, despite the fact that she's famous. And I think sometimes in her case in particular, it can be tempting to forget that she was a scientist, not just a naturalist, not just somebody who integrated into a wild animal community for the very first time and perhaps the last time in human history, but that she was a scientist in the full sense of the term, where she came back and she wrote up her results and analyzed data and agonized over interpretation, et cetera. And so she deserves to be cited when people are talking about termite fishing. She deserves to be cited when we talk about facultative bipedalism. That's in that paper too. She rarely gets cited for that. She's the first person to document that in a grade 8. So I think the one thing I would just say is, for students, bother to go back and find out who made the original discoveries, not just the paper that you found it in that was published in 2020, And then the second thing is, I really like this, studying nature versus studying science, or loving nature versus doing science. I really think that almost every scientist can say that they either came to love nature through loving science or vice versa. And I'm like you, I got to love doing science only because I loved the nature first and went into the woods after getting out of school, because that was where I was drawn. And I think that if we do love the organisms, we're going to have a natural proclivity to finding out the people and their research who also love them. And Jane Goodall's nothing if not a lover of nature and a lover of chimps and a lover of animals. And her two examples of how she expands beyond chimps. One is that her favorite animal is actually not a chimp. She said this to David Letterman and all different kinds of people, but her favorite, anybody out there know what her favorite animal is? A dog, okay, yeah. I'm in New York, so it was dog, but it is the same species. But yeah, that was her favorite animal, and that was the first animal that she had a relationship with. She also loved chicken. She spent 5 hours one time in her chicken coop just watching the way a hen would lay an egg. It took her 5 hours in order for the hen to lay the egg. And her parents actually called the police and reported her missing during that time period. And finally, I think Jessica mentioned the institute that she started, the Roots and Shoots program, which introduced children to nature and to conservation, is named after plants. Roots for her are the underground, like us, the people who really understand what it means to love nature and want to preserve it. And then the shoots are the young people who find a way through the morass and the net of all of their social media and all of their other influences to actually rise up and make change. So I would say, this is a long, meandering way of saying, I think that if we love nature, we will find Jane Goodall, because she's also a love of nature, and her stuff will always be out there for us to find.
That's a really nice image. Thank you for that. So we're coming up to the end of the hour. So we'll play a little game, which is please complete the following sentence that starts with. And so, Jessica, your question, which has been answered, but, we haven't heard your answer to it, is Dr. Jane Goodall's most enduring scientific idea was ...
Tool use.
All right.
So I think, we now know that chimpanzees use so many different kinds of tools. They have tool boxes. They use tools to make tools. And I think that this was just a fantastic discovery that really changed the way we think.
Great, thank you. David, your sentence starts with, one myth about studying chimpanzee behavior you'd like to retire is ...
Well, one of the wonderful things is that a lot of the myths, we've talked about a lot of the myths that have already been shattered. But if I had to be honest about this and say there's an idea in the community that is still there that I wish would be retired, it would probably be that we can use chimpanzees as a simple model system for how humans used to be. It is well-meaning, but we split with our ancestry split with that of the chimps about 6 to 7 million years ago, which means that there's 13 million years of independent evolution between us, and a lot can happen in 13 million years. Chimps are not our ancestors, and so we really ought to keep them, to respect them, not as quasi-humans, not as almost humans, but as their own species. And I think this channels Jane Goodall a bit, and I'll go back to the titles of those 2 books of hers, her reflective books on chimps. In the Shadow of Man was a sad title. It was her own title, not an editorial title. And she was saying that chimps are their own society and humans are influencing them in such a way that could be detrimental to them. And she was cautioning us about that. And then the second one, Through a Window, is even more indicative of her idea that we should not just be seeing them through the lens of humans. We're looking through a window to see them. We can't enter the life of a chimp, really. We can't enter their head. We can't know what they're about. And that should generate some respect, some distance, some humility, and certainly not an assumption that they were just sort of on the road to us.
Thank you. And Kristin, your sentence starts with one practical action a non-scientist can take this month for the ethical treatment of animals is ...
To notice the animals that are right in front of you, the non-human animals that are in this room, the tiny spiders, the pigeons on the street, the rats that run around on the subway. You don't have to go to Africa in order to study animal minds and behavior. They're right here, and I think Jane Goodall would want us all to appreciate the animals that we see every day, just as much as we appreciate the chimpanzees.
Thank you for that, and thank you so much for listening and coming today.